Hello, and I hope your revision's going well. I'm sharing a screen here that just goes over the GCSE revision that you're no doubt in the middle of. Jamie's mentioned very helpfully that the two sections that we're a little bit nebulous on, and they're not so much the religious section, the religious community on Christianity, which is about the Bible, how liberals and conservatives interpret it with examples, and how they view its authority as special revelation, other sources of authority, conscience, reason, science, religious communities and leaders, festivals, pilgrimage, places of worship, forms of worship. Those are topics that are pretty much about factual learning. Jamie's raised the issues of 1.1 and 1.2 as particularly vague. So you've got to talk about the origin of the universe and the place of human beings in it, religious beliefs and their purpose, human beings and their responsibility for the planet. Lots of topics to think about there. And you've no doubt got your own revision guides to help you with them. But if we just take that one there on responsibility for the planet. So we can look at some past paper questions, but you could think about specific ways Christians might express responsibility for the planet. Things like trying to have more energy efficient homes, using electric cars, thinking about where their gas and electricity is produced. Is it produced by renewable energy? A sense of maybe campaigning, writing to MPs, getting involved in movements that, not necessarily Extinction Rebellion, but in environmental movements that raise people's awareness through education and that get involved in political lobbying of government to put this on the agenda. We are moving towards electric cars by, I think, 2030 to 50. I think the aim is to sort of convert or switch over to that. We have had our consciousness raised by Greta Thunberg about these questions, and David Attenborough. There's a new prize to sort of bring environmental awareness to the consciousness of people, and lots of films have raised this issue, documentaries about global warming. So why should Christians be responsible for the planet in this way? Well, as stewards of God's gift of the environment, God who creates and sustains the universe, to undermine his work by burning fossil fuels, being careless about our carbon footprint, is something that we should be deeply concerned about. And the animals are other elements of God's creation, and overfishing and maybe factory farming. Something like 31 billion animals a year are produced in the factory farming industry, and often in inhumane conditions. How do we express our stewardship of the world? So in Genesis it says, go forth and multiply, subdue the earth, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living creature that moves upon the face of the ground. But that rulership isn't about domination. It's about being in the image of God, ruling like God would rule, in justice and sustainability. Those are big issues there. So ways in which we can exercise responsibility, practical examples, are our relationship with other creatures, including the commonality of all living beings. Often religion is seen to put a big gap between humans and animals because of this speciesism accusation that's thrown at religious people. But while Christians do think that humans have a soul and animals don't really have a soul, and they have the potential for a relationship with their creator in a way that animals don't, animals do reflect the glory of God in creation. The diversity, the teeming life that is on this planet is something that celebrates God's creative diversity and the spectacular nature of animals that face extinction, like tigers or African elephants or rhinos, is something that we should be concerned to sustain, to be stewards of, and to care for. It's not only prudent, but it's also part of the proper worship of God as God's vice-regent, as it were, as people made in God's image. So how we should treat animals and animal rights. Obviously, this language of animal rights has come in with human rights language, which really grew up with the International Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. And when we confer rights upon animals, it's giving them a kind of legal status that affords them protection. Doesn't necessarily mean that we give them citizenship or a passport, although Peter Singer has in fact campaigned for mountain gorillas in southern Uganda in the impenetrable national park there, to be given passports so that they can be protected from poachers by the soldiers that protect them. But animals have rights as well, because too often they were used in experimentation, and their lives were made more of a burden than a benefit. The Draize test, which famously poured toxic chemicals into the eyes of rabbits to see what levels of concentration would blind a rabbit, which has a very similar eye to a human. The banning of cosmetic tests, or tests for cosmetic products like shampoo, which was European-wide, that came in, I think in the late 80s, is a good example of where animal rights have been elevated and promoted. So that's something to think about there. Being made in the image of God is something that's really important. Of course, as Irenaeus said, we have to grow into his likeness. But what is God? God is a relational being. He's a being who's creative and sustains the universe. And Christians believe that they, as his active agents, having been conferred with that responsibility, should protect life. The second section here is about religious beliefs about human nature and the immortality of the soul. So what do Christians believe about the afterlife and about the imitation or the nature of the soul? Well, Christianity teaches that we have an eternal soul that's a gift from God. That is something that we're blessed with. In terms of afterlife, we have there's this teaching in Christianity that when you die, that's not the end, that there is an afterlife, there's a judgment, as it says in the Creed, that Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead. And Christians very much believe that there is an afterlife in which there will be a judgment and a preparedness for that. Now, Jesus teaches lots of parables about this. There's the parable of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus says to those on his left, the goats, depart from me, you never knew me, because when I was hungry and thirsty and naked and imprisoned, you never came to me, you never clothed me, you never fed me, you never visited me. And he'll say to the righteous, the sheep on his right, blessed are you of my Father, come into heaven, into eternal dwelling. So the difference between the righteous and the unrighteous there is what they do and don't do in obedience, in caring for the marginalized. So what do Christians believe about the afterlife? They believe that through Jesus's death and resurrection, faith in Christ and Christ's gift of salvation is something that can't be earned, but the proper response of obedience to God's gift of his Son and the sacrifice of his Son on the cross, the proper response of obedience is to care for the marginalized, to reflect Jesus's life, to be followers or disciples of Jesus. So what did Jesus do? He went out to the lost sheep of Israel, as he put it, to the publicans, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the drunkards, the sinners, the blind, the cripples, the lame, and he spent his time with them. So Christians ought to do likewise. And you need to think about this idea of immortality in the soul. Christians disagree. This is a good place to bring in differences. So more fundamentalists would take the view that hell is eternal conscious torment. That's something that John Calvin would have believed, that because the offense is against the kind of way that the medieval world would have described it is, if you offend a commoner, that's less serious than if you offend the monarch, the king. And is God as the King of Kings, then to offend him is worthy of eternal punishment. Other Christians would take an annihilationist view, that you kind of only wake up if you believe and have received salvation. And more liberal Christians, who are more pluralist in their outlook, would say that salvation, eternal life begin now. They're really about living life not for yourself but for others, and that God will judge the hearts of people. He sees into their minds and into their deeds, and he will judge them. I guess part of the problem with this is that the language of judgment in the New Testament has since been developed in literature and paintings. You think of Dante's Divine Comedy, which looks at inferno, hell, paradiso, heaven, and purgatory, purgatory in the middle. And in the Catholic view, of course, there is this place of purgation where you're purified to enter into the presence of a holy God. So you come out of earthly sin and you're in need of purification, and you would spend time in purgatory and then enter into heaven. And Protestants generally don't believe in purgatory. They believe in a kind of judgment after death that separates the righteous and the unrighteous. I guess some more liberal Christians would say things like, if Jesus says, forgive your enemies, just as your Father in heaven lets the sun and the rain fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, he's gracious. How can God act in a way that's contrary to what he's telling humans to do? So if Jesus says forgive 70 times 7, how can God eternally punish people? So hell in the modern Christian understanding has had quite a pounding from more liberal thinkers on this issue. Some very liberal thinkers like Rudolf Bultmann, a German writing in the 20th century, he attempted to demythologize all of this. He thought of hell and heaven as mythological, and he wanted to kind of repackage them in terms of existential ideas. In other words, you can have a hell on earth. Auschwitz is a hell on earth, and you can seek to create more just and fair societies, which is kind of bringing heaven on earth. So when you say in the Lord's Prayer that thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, you're praying for justice, for hope, for love to come on earth as it is in heaven. So everything from the very literalist view of afterlife from John Calvin to annihilationists who think that you'll only wake up if you've put your faith in Christ and you receive his grace, right through to more liberal thinkers who would demythologize this whole language of the afterlife. Those are nice ways of showing diversity in your view on that. Another area here is selfishness, greed, and ignorance. How do these contribute to sin? Now, this is set up so that all religions can be covered in this. And obviously, in Hinduism and Islam and Judaism, They might give slightly different questions, but there is quite a lot in common in terms of how selfishness, greed, and ignorance contribute to sin and suffering, and how they're the root causes of human wrongdoing. So you could say things like, what is it that causes violence? Violence often seems to work under the presupposition that vengeance, revenge, retribution kind of makes you feel better, to get even, to punish the criminal in a ruthlessly hard, retributive way. And, if we take ignorance, for example, if you look at the prison populations of this country, you'll find very high rates of prisoners who have very low levels of literacy. You'll have very high rates of prisons populations that have been in care homes from a very early age, alarming percentages of those two. So if we take ignorance to mean a lack of education, a lack of a loving home, a lack of stability as contributing forces, to have a retributive view of justice and say, the way to deal with people who have done criminal acts is to slam them up, lock them up, and throw away the key. To be tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. That kind of ignores the fact that this is a revolving door. What's called recidivism, the rate of reoffence, it's something like over 66% of males will be back in prison within 2 to 5 years of coming out. I think it may even be higher than that. Now, if you have a retributive view of justice, it's just pretty ignorant to think the way to solve this problem is just throw people in jail and chuck away the key. The way to solve this problem is education. It's to enable prisoners while they're in prison to gain some form of rehabilitation, to think of themselves as citizens. And that's what the Swedish and Scandinavian prison services do, and they have a far lower rate of reoffence. So just looking at it economically, that's better value for money to do it that way. You can look at how greed contributes to sin. So often human behavior is selfish, and if we think of this globally, we're going to look at how economic systems often keep many African nations, for example, in the global trade talks that take place every few years. Many African countries are outgunned in terms of international trade lawyers, and they are often the worst off in terms of the terms they get from the World Trade Organization's kind of rounds of talks. But on a personal level, we could think, what do we do for the poorest in the world, the bottom billion? How much of our disposable income could we give away to help those who are suffering from malaria, or to give to deworming charities, or to give to homeless charities working in Manchester? Those are things we might think of. So lots and lots to think about there. We looked at free will and determinism as well. And, in these sections here, you've got loads of questions about the Bible, authority, beliefs and values. You also have to be aware of your arguments for the existence of God, the design argument, the causal argument. Everything that has a beginning must have a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore it must have a cause. It cannot be self-caused. And you cannot have an infinite regression. It just can't go back endlessly. It must have to have a first cause, a prime mover. And this cause we call God. Just being able to rattle off arguments like that, or to think on the reverse, why do people not believe in God? What are people's reasons for atheism? You might say, well, many people would say that science has displaced religion as the chief authority in our society. So along comes Darwin. He has 20, 30 years of research to establish the natural selection and the survival of the species. by competition, and that's gathered force with our whole modern understanding of genetics and how our human evolution emerges out of animals and chimpanzees and so on. So for many people, that's where you go for explanations about the origins of life. You don't go to books written in the Bronze Age or 2,500-600 years ago. They're just pre-scientific, and they are works of literature that we can view in a secular way. That's how many people would read the Bible and dismiss it. And they might say, like Rudolf Bultmann, that German scholar I mentioned who demythologized everything, you can't live at the same time in a world where you help yourself to modern medicine and modern technology, and at the same time have one foot in the first century world where miracles are commonplace, where the dead are raised, where the blind see, and so on. So for him, you needed to demythologize all these miracles and take an extremely liberal view. That's not the view that Orthodox Christians take, and Bultmann was a very controversial figure. Many people saw him as undermining Christianity, along with lots of other more liberal scholars. And there is a kind of middle way between fundamentalism that just sort of closes its ears and doesn't want to hear from science and pretends that humans and dinosaurs can kind of walk together in these creation museums like you see in the United States. And on the other hand, those who throw the baby out with the bathwater and say you can't have religion and science, they are incompatible. Someone like Richard Dawkins would say that. There is a position in the middle where you can say, no, it's quite possible to be a 21st century rational believer in modern mainstream science and interpret the Bible in a way that gives you more scope to understand how you can synthesize science and religion. And that's a debate for another day. Why else would people kind of not believe in God? Obviously, the problem of evil and suffering, that's the rock of atheism that often crashes people's faith. How can a good and loving God allow suffering and evil in the world on the scale that we experience it? When we think about the Holocaust, when we think about the number of deaths through plagues, through wars, how could God press the start button on a world where there would be so much suffering of humans and animals? So science could be one reason. The problem of evil and suffering could be another reason why people don't believe in God. I guess a third reason might be people look at the biblical texts and they would, in their view, have contradictions in, or they might refer to, let's say, the pillars of the earth and have a pre-scientific view. And so they would say their reason would want to put scriptures in the same category as other ancient Babylonian literature, Egyptian literature, Greek literature. Sure, sources of ancient wisdom, but not places you get your moral teaching from. That would be one argument. Another big argument is what's called the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God tells you it's good, or does God tell you it's good because it is good in and of itself? And this was set out by Euthyphro, an ancient Greek at the time of, in a dialogue with Euthyphro by Socrates that Plato outlines. And it's essentially saying, is something good because God ordains it? He divinely commands it. If God had commanded, on feast days, once a year, go out and steal, this is my command, then that would make it good, would it? And of course, the Euthyphro dilemma wants to say, no, it wouldn't. Either God's commands are completely arbitrary. That's one horn of the dilemma. God can tell you to steal on feast days. That would be completely arbitrary. Or if it's not completely arbitrary, God's sovereignty is in question, because there's a kind of moral law above God that tells God what's right and wrong. God has to consult the moral law. And if we can access the moral law through reason, we can bypass God. We don't need faith. We can just do it through reason. So the Euthyphro dilemma wants to say, and atheists today would want to say, you don't need to get your morality from God. Reason will allow you to access it. We don't need to worry that when we have vanquished God from our minds and our belief systems, that people are going to go out and kind of steal and break the law, because there are good rational reasons to be a citizen of a stable country in which private property is protected and the laws continue. So lots of questions there. What I would say is, if this video hasn't covered a question for you, then do pop up on Teams a question that you have, and I'll either answer it by video or I'll type out an answer to it. So in your revision, anything that you're stuck on, pop it up there and I'll type it out. And equally, if you're doing questions and you want me to have a look over them and give you a kind of sense of what your answers would get, then pop that up either on Teams or by email to me and I'll have a look at it then. All the best with your revision. I hope that some of it at least is enjoyable. Thank you very much. I'll just